Hey, Senator, good to be back with you. I want to jump right into the questions here. Whatever budget you'll approve this year will ultimately include funding for long-term projects that will last well beyond the end of the fiscal year. You'll vote, the president will sign it, and then construction workers will start bidding and shoveling and building. They might not actually get paid for years down the road until after their work is done. So, understanding that context, do you believe that a president in the future, maybe a Democrat, can go back in time, and block federal spending that Congress already approved?
Well, I think we're talking about grant funding, Mark. So if you want to be specific, the pause on the grant funding is to make sure that these programs don't violate, discriminatory protections like, having DEI in the grants. And so the executive branch is fully within its authority to pause grant funding to make sure they're legal. And I think what we're seeing, take for example USAID, Congress doesn't line item $2 million for Guatemalan sex changes, and it doesn't line item $6 million or $6 billion or whatever the number was for DEI trainings in Burma. They allocate dollars to USAID and then they spend it. So it's perfectly legal for the President of the United States within the executive branch to decide how that money is going to be spent. The difference between a lot of the lawsuits I had as AG in Missouri was Joe Biden was trying to do things those agencies were never charged with doing, like OSHA forcing a vaccine on 100 million people. This is perfectly within the purview of the federal government and the executive branch specifically to decide personnel issues and how to allocate those dollars.
It sounds like you're delineating grants from other ongoing infrastructure funding. I'll give you an example, though, about this grant funding from NBC News. A Johns Hopkins neuroscientist working to develop treatments and therapeutics for kids with developmental disabilities tells NBC News that President Trump and Elon Musk's cuts to the National Institutes of Health grants could compromise their research. This researcher called it, quote, devastating news for the parents. The White House says it will fund, quote, legitimate scientific research, but who in the White House is qualified to decide what science is legitimate?
So I'm glad you brought this up because this is a lot of misinformation about it that's being spun by the left and their media allies. The truth of the matter is, NIH funding, we want to have more money for research. Right now, under those grants, you can use 60% of the money for bureaucracy and utilities and rent and stuff that doesn't have anything to do with research. And so what they're doing is they're creating new guidelines to say, you can't use 60% of that, you can use 15% of that. So more money goes to research. As it relates to your other question about construction projects, the truth is when the money was allocated by Congress, Mark, it was for projects. What happened then is these agencies started putting ridiculous criteria on it that Congress never voted for, like, for example, a chips factory in Arizona. They weren't able to build it because they hadn't hired enough ex-convicts. Broadband wasn't being deployed because small contractors didn't have a climate action plan. So I think it's really important to sort of dig into the weeds here of money that's allocated and then agencies putting on additional burdens that Congress never intended. And NIH funding specifically, more money should go to research and less money should go to bureaucrats.
Of course, Congress has oversight of the funds. And to be clear, the media report that I cited there from NBC News did articulate that. It spelled out that universities can charge rent or other fees, basically a share of that grant funding. But I want to ask you specifically about WashU and St. Louis University here in St. Louis. They get tens of millions of dollars in federal grant funding through the NIH, National Science Foundation, Defense Department, Energy. Are you doing anything to protect the work these universities are doing?
I've talked to them about it. We've had outreach and I've talked to them about it, clarified a lot of the misinformation that the money's still going to flow through these NIH granting, assuming they're worthwhile, right? Of course, that would be an important function of government is oversight, but assuming it's worthwhile, the only thing that's being talked about is reducing the amount for bureaucrats from 60% to 15% so you can use more money from research. And I think that quelled a lot of concerns.
There are also concerns about the government workforce right now. A lot of these sweeping cuts or the mass firings, they're all being done under the guise of gutting DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion out of federal government. You've alluded to that here. St. Louis is, of course, home to a foundational piece of black history in America. The old courthouse is expected to open from its renovations this spring or summer. Inside those doors, you'll find ugly stories of America's original sin, about Dred and Harriet Scott, a number of other enslaved Americans. But the old courthouse gets federal funding from the National Park Service. Should historians there be free to tell the ugly truths about American history without fear of funding cuts?
Yeah, look, I'm glad you raised this because this is not the same thing. The idea, of course, St. Louis played an important role. The Dred Scott case was very important in our nation's history. We should tell those stories. DEI is about cultural Marxism, Mark. It is about dividing the room in half by oppressor versus oppressed no matter what. It doesn't belong in our schools. It doesn't belong in our military. So it's not about telling stories. It's about struggle sessions and discriminatory hiring practices. It's about quotas. People reject that. That stuff's illegal, and we shouldn't be funding that stuff. But of course we should learn about our history, but those are two very different things.
All right, Senator, I'm told that we're out of time, but thanks for hopping on with us.